Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and introduce myself today. Carla, did you say 20 minutes? No problem at all. It's just 5 minutes, and she's really been serious about that, so I'm going to have to speed through a lot of things I'd love to say. For those of you who have pen and paper, take it out and write down johnbuckley.org. I have to learn to say that all the time in media interviews to get that website out there, but you can write it down too. As mentioned, I'm the Libertarian Party candidate for the United States Senate in West by God, Virginia, which I think is one of the most beautiful states in the nation. I've been in politics for 40 years or so. I began in active politics as a freshman in high school and have done a lot of things, and it's very exciting to be the Libertarian candidate. The energy this year, in polls in my state have not included me, so I don't know where I stand in the polls in my race. But when I read about other Libertarian candidates around the country this year and showing up in the polls in notable percentages and the excitement and the verve and the vibrations, I really get the feeling this year is going to be a pretty darn exciting year for Libertarian Party, Libertarian candidates, and Libertarian principles. And it's exciting to be a part of this. Any candidates in the audience, just raise your hands. It's bravo for being a candidate. Fantastic. And what about campaign managers and treasurers and people holding just specific duties in a campaign? Raise your hand. And how many people have given a donation to a Libertarian candidate for office this year? Excellent. Now write down johnbuckley.org, all you donors, please. No, it's tough raising money when, and I forget his name, the gentleman who's running for state rep in Ohio talked about his $250,000 campaign. He was hoping to eventually make a $500,000 campaign. I was just drooling because any fraction of that would be wonderful. So yes, write down johnbuckley.org. That would be terrific. But help your local candidates. Over my career, I've been the national chairman of Young Americans for Freedom, a conservative student organization. I was elected to the House of Delegates in Virginia as a Republican in 1979. I served as I was an elector for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and over my career I've worked for libertarian small L organizations like the Cato Institute, Institute for Humane Studies, National Tax Limitation Committee, Law and Economics Center, George Mason University. I just retired after 12 years as an attorney at the United States Court of Federal Claims in Washington, D.C. And I switched to the Libertarian Party in 1991, thanks to Bill Redpath, Mark Montoni, Jim Lark, Virginia Libertarians, who made it a very hospitable home. I didn't leave the Republican Party left me, as far as I'm concerned. I think my principles have stayed the same the entire time, but the home for those principles is the Libertarian Party. And I'm glad to be a part of it, and to be a candidate. It's tough to be a candidate in the Libertarian Party. We're underfunded. We don't have the resources, the precinct organization, all of we have great talent, but we don't have as much of it in numbers. And so it's tough, and as a candidate you go through a lot of ups and downs, and I faced that in my own campaign just in the few months that I've been running. It's tough because you're the chief cook and bottle washer, you're trying to raise money, you're trying to write literature, you're trying to go out and campaign, you're trying to organize, you're trying to plan ahead. And you go through, at least I have, I don't know about the other candidates, but bouts of frustration and valleys of despair, and then the next day a donation comes in the mail, or a volunteer pops up on the website, and you reach an energy high. And I've had to realize for myself that those valleys of despair and those mountains of high energy are the terrain of West Virginia. So I've got to get used to it. I bought a new car in February, and I put 9,000 miles on my car, and we're only to the end of June. And it's going to be, it's a great state. It's a lot of mileage, and some of the roads are tiny and winding, and I love it. And there's a great receptiveness to our message, as there would be in any state, and there is in West Virginia. West Virginians don't like Barack Obama, and I chat to people and they nod their head absolutely, and I say that at the same time I'm not a big business Republican either. And then they grab the literature and they start looking through it. And I think there's a lot of in between there for libertarians this year to get our message out in different ways. Because our message is, we take the best, I like to describe it as we take the best of the red, economic liberties, private property, cutting spending, cutting taxes, deregulation, and we match it, we take the best of the blue of the emphasis on peace and civil liberties and privacy, and we marry them together. And that's our consistent platform of individual liberty. We are the purple, taking the best of the red and the blue. The Libertarian Party is the purple, and that's the message that I think a lot of the American people would respond to if we have the resources to get our message out. And this is the year for it. We've seen some extraordinary things across the political spectrum in primaries and elections so far this year, and we're poised to be a part of that. Both of my major party candidates are women. One's the Secretary of State, the Democrat. The other is a seven-term Congresswoman. It's an open seat. Jay Rockefeller stepping down. I say to people, if a Rockefeller can get elected in West Virginia, so can a Buckley. We'll see how that works. But the media's all gaga because they say this year West Virginia is definitely going to set a record. For the first time ever, West Virginia is going to elect a woman. I say, whoa, wait. So I told them, okay, we're going to set a record, either a woman or the gay guy. So let the media write that up. We're going to set a record in West Virginia this year. My slogan is live and let live. I'm a full-time candidate, and I'm going to shoot for the moon. I realize everyone says they're going to win. I don't know whether I'm going to win, but I'm going to run trying to win. And in running trying to win, I know we're going to accomplish things for the Libertarian Party and for our principles in the state. I don't know how high we will get, but we're going to go for broke. I hope not. Let me finish with one of the things I'm doing to try to keep the campaign on the light side. It's just a little bit of fun and helps me poke a little fun at my opponents. I started a couple months ago on my campaign Facebook page, that would be John Buckley WV, a song of the day, where I take a YouTube video and link to a song, and whether by the song title or the lyrics, I try to make a comment about the campaign or a dig at my opponents. So for instance, every Friday, I make a dig at my Republican opponent. She's the front runner. Everybody thinks she's going to win. She has the big bucks. She's a moderate, stand for nothing, stay in the middle of the road, don't stick your neck out ever on anything kind of Republican. So every Friday is my dig at her. Yesterday, the song of the day, well, the message was Capito. Her name is Shelley Capito. Capito to her big biz backers. The song of the day was Britney Spears' I'm a Slave for You. A couple of weeks before, it was Capito to her big business backers, and the song was Lean on Me. That's every Friday, so keep an eye out for that. A song earlier this week, I said, wrote, my opponents are all talk when it comes to cutting spending. The song of the day from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, science fiction double feature. Just lighthearted, and I'll leave you with this. Will West Virginia elect a woman? This is my message song of the day earlier this week or last. Will West Virginia elect a woman? Maybe yes, maybe no. The song of the day by Denise Williams was, Let's Hear It for the Boy. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, you're all having a good time, right? Good food, good speakers. We have another great one coming up. I have a prepared introduction, but I also want to say that when I discovered that Mark Skousen was a descendant of Benjamin Franklin, I got really excited, and he's well known for his financial stuff. And but I think the Benjamin Franklin angle is just awesome. And especially tying in with the theme of the convention. Benjamin Franklin was a character and a man of great character. Dr. Mark Skousen, the title of his talk today is Benjamin Franklin, Conservative, Social Democrat, or Libertarian. Mark happens to be the 6th-generation grandson of Benjamin Franklin. He is also the producer of Freedom Fest, which is the Washington Post calls the greatest libertarian show on earth, and I highly recommend it. It starts in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas. I know it might be difficult for some of us to get there. There are flyers on the table. There is if you order your ticket online and put in the code LP, you get a discount. And I highly encourage you to try to attend that event coming up in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas. Like his famous ancestor, Dr. Skousen is a writer and publisher, having been the editor-in-chief of Forecasts and Strategies, an investment newsletter, since 1980. He is a professional economist and the author of over 25 books, including The Making of Modern Economics and The Maxims of Wall Street. He has taught economics and finance at Columbia Business School and is currently a presidential fellow at Chapman University in California. In 2006, on the 300th anniversary of Benjamin Franklin's birth, he compiled and edited, along with his wife, the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, thus fulfilling Franklin's lifelong ambition that one of his descendants complete his autobiography. And Dr. Skousen has brought copies of that book, which he will sign and autograph at the end of his talk. I encourage you to purchase those. So, Mark.
Oh, yes.
Let's bring up Mark Skousen.
Benjamin Franklin said, "He that boasts of his ancestors does but advertise his own insignificance." So that put me in my place. But we do like to worship at the trough of the founders. The founders have a pretty good reputation over these years. And one of the things I found in writing and doing research about my illustrious ancestor Benjamin Franklin is that it's very difficult to categorize the person, to label them. We always want to label everybody, don't we? We're conservatives, we're libertarians, we're leftists, we're rightists, we're progressives. We all like to have a label, but you really have a hard time. I think the basic notion that I want to present today, my basic point, is that you can't buttonhole Ben Franklin in any particular category. And that's great, because I can speak to a group of hardcore Democrats who will love my speech on Benjamin Franklin. On the other hand, I can speak to a group of blue blood conservatives, Republicans, and they will love Benjamin Franklin. It'll be a tougher case to make the case that you will love Benjamin Franklin as libertarians. But I will make the best effort I can. So, and that will require me to counter the views of one of your favorite apostles, Murray Rothbard. So, Benjamin Franklin's a unique character among the founders. He was at the creation of the three most important documents of American government. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He helped write the Articles of Confederation. And, of course, through his compromising efforts, we have the United States Constitution. Franklin was an advocate of a limited central government. He was not a big fan of the executive or of a single president. However, he really liked the legislature and believed in democracy. Now, here's a statement that I think you all appreciate. And it's fitting very much with the theme of character that you have here. And here's what he said. And I found this in doing the research and completing Franklin's autobiography, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But here's the quote. "A virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed." He was a disciple of Adam Smith and free trade, and was enamored with the laissez-faire policies of the physiocrats in France. He wrote admirably, "Laissez-faire, let us alone, and not to govern too strictly. He certainly was no Keynesian, although one may argue that he was more of a Chicago monetarist. He defended the rich and was worried about how incentives for the poor would affect them in a welfare program. He opposed the minimum wage law that was proposed at the time. He wrote in favor of free immigration, open borders, and fast population growth, which he tried to perpetuate himself. Single-handedly. He rejected any form of state religion or mandatory religious oaths of office, and he demanded that slavery be abolished in the new nation way before George Washington or Thomas Jefferson ever let their slaves go. And he learned by sad experience through his son and grandson that public service is less rewarding than private business. His foreign policy anticipated George Washington's farewell address by nearly 20 years. He wrote in 1778, quote, "The policy of America is to have commerce with all and war with none." So I see you're warming up to my presentation. Franklin was no free-thinking anarchist, sorry to say. In economics, he favored paper money and the real bills doctrine of expanding the money supply beyond specie, though no more than commerce requires. That's the real bills doctrine that we talk about in economics. Easy money, he said, would facilitate trade within reason. During the American Revolution, he justified runaway inflation. Now listen to this. You'll love this excuse for runaway inflation. It is an indirect way for all Americans to pay for the war. He really despised the tax evaders who refused to pay their fair share in this great cause of the American Revolution. Although he did beg Congress to improve the creditworthiness of the United States, after all, he was selling government loans, American loans, to the French at the time. He said, at least pay interest in hard currency, will you? Of course, they never did. However, he's a strong supporter of Hamiltonian central banking. Of course, he was an investor in the Bank of North American Stock, which was Robert Morris's bank, so he had a vested interest. And of course, his likeness on the $100 bill would please his vanity. Irredeemable American paper money. So, anyway, by the way, he's also in the 50-cent piece. Prior to the, in 1964, they changed it to Kennedy after the assassination of 65. But prior to that, for over a dozen years, the half dollar had Benjamin Franklin's image on it. And so you have the paper $100 bill, and you have the 50-cent piece. And it's interesting that over the next 50-some years, 60-some years, the 50-cent piece is now worth about $12, and the $100 paper money is still only worth $100. So it could be that at some point the half dollar will be worth more than the Franklin paper money. He argued that the state should be actively engaged in the free education of youth. So he was a big fan of democracy in that respect, and in dispelling ignorance of public fads and superstitions. Franklin was in league with Jefferson in emphasizing the themes of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the goal of government, downplaying Locke's inalienable right of property, which is left out of the trilogy in the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of reasons for that. But he said property is purely a creature of society, thank you, and can be legitimately taxed to pay for civil society. He was quite critical of Americans unwilling to pay their fair share of society's dues. So among libertarians, the leading detractor is Murray Rothbard. So I want to talk a little bit about his attack on Franklin in his 4-volume history, Conceived in Liberty. Any of you read that, those 4 volumes? 1 volume's missing, by the way. Supposed to be the most controversial, but anyway, here's what Rothbard says about Franklin. The most overinflated leader of the entire colonial period in America. Rothbard deprecates Franklin's achievements and accentuates his peccadillos. The sly old Dr. Franklin is, quote, a sinister, subversive devil, an opportunist par excellence, cunning, fawning, meddling, opportunistic hedonist. I thought he was describing libertarians there. Franklin, according to Rothbard's version, was a warmonger, a Tory imperialist, and a speculator with his cronies who engaged in a pattern of plunder of the American taxpayer during the war. His Albany plan was more than an innocent way to unify the nation, but was a deliberate attempt to create a central super government. In his long history, Franklin comes off almost as badly as the deep-dyed conservative George Washington, who is characterized as a fumbling, inept general who sought to crush liberty and individualism among his soldiers and impose a statist army, losing one campaign after another. You guys read this book? Pretty amazing revisionist history. Rothbard would have preferred the forgotten hero, the brilliant, gifted Charles Lee, as the American general champion of liberty and guerrilla warfare. And instead of Franklin as envoy to France, Rothbard chose the estimable liberal and Whigite Dr. Arthur Lee. Never mind that other historians uniformly describe Lee as bilious and cantankerous patriot who hated the French and accomplished little. In fact, Arthur Lee, as one of the commissioners, when Franklin went over to France to be the first ambassador, he was 70 years of age and they didn't trust him. So they sent over 5 other commissioners, including Arthur Lee and William Lee, and sent over John Adams at some point and so forth. You know how much money they raised? How much money did Arthur and his brother William raise? How much money did John Adams raise for the American cause in France? 0. Nothing. Franklin raised every single franc or livre, which was the currency at the time. Rothbard also likes Thomas Paine. Who doesn't? Author of the libertarian pamphlet Common Sense and promoter extraordinaire of the American cause. Interestingly, Rothbard ignores the fact that Paine's mentor was none other than Benjamin Franklin, and that Franklin was a lifelong supporter of Paine's ideas, even when they were radical. What did Paine see that Rothbard couldn't? Rothbard never explains the fact that somehow by July 1776, the Tory imperialist Franklin suddenly became the radical revolutionary Franklin, along with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Franklin was indeed one of the first founders to call for independence. In 1775, he called for the drafting of all ties, to dissolve all ties of allegiance. And he said this: "It has always been my opinion that it is the natural right of men to quit, when they please, the society or state and the country in which they are born, and either join with another or form a new one as they think proper." Furthermore, Franklin, like Rothbard, appeared to be an advocate of natural rights. Quote, "I am a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power. I am naturally very jealous for the rights and liberties of my country, and the least encroachment of those invaluable privileges is apt to make my blood boil." Now, no libertarian could have said that better. Franklin is given no credit for the radical and libertarian Pennsylvania Constitution written in 1776 and endorsed by Franklin throughout his lifetime. And what about Franklin's critical role in raising military and financial aid in France? He was given little credit other than the following sentence from Rothbard's Poison Pen. Quote, "The wily old tactician Franklin proved to be a master at the intricacies of lying, bamboozling, and intriguing, that form of warp and woof of diplomacy. Moreover, the old rogue was a huge hit with the French, who saw him as the embodiment of reason, the natural man, and bon ami." Unquote. Not surprisingly, Rothbard is deadly silent about Franklin's thrill of victory and Arthur Lee's agony of defeat when it came to fundraising for the American cause. Rothbard also ignores Franklin's libertarian views regarding military service. This is one of the more interesting aspects of Franklin, and I don't think Rothbard knew about this. If he had, he might have changed his views. So Franklin preferred a private militia over a publicly financed army. According to the historian Lorraine Smith Pangel, who wrote a wonderful book called The Political Philosophy of Benjamin Franklin, says, although he willingly did his part as a common soldier, listen to this, he had no taste for a good fight, no love of danger, no attraction to the glories of heroic self-overcoming. So much did he hate tyranny and love liberty, reason, and gentle persuasion that he could not see the need for military discipline. Now, in today's world where we honor our soldiers who come back from Iraq and our veterans and so forth, and you get the first ones to be on the plane, and we have all of these documentaries about soldiers and so forth. This part about Franklin is pretty interesting. In fact, he said captains general should be elected by their peers, not appointed. Very interesting. His whole thing about military. Believe me, George Washington would have fired Ben Franklin like that if he had been there, because Washington was really a difficult person in that regard. I see I've offended people already. Finally, Rothbard fails to quote Franklin's negative views on war in general. Listen to this. When will men be convinced that even successful wars do at length become misfortunes to those who unjustly commerce them, and who triumph blindly in their success, not seeing all its consequences? There is so little good gained, and so much mischief done generally by wars, that I wish the imprudence of undertaking them was more evident to princes. For in my opinion, there never was a good war or a bad peace. What vast additions to the conveniences and comforts of living might mankind have acquired if the money spent in wars had been employed in works of public utility? So he goes on here about this. To show how difficult this view is, I could talk a lot about different aspects, and in the Q&A I'd be glad to talk about Franklin's views on religion, his views on women, and so forth. But let's just talk a little bit about some of the economics from Franklin. In many ways, Franklin was America's first champion of free enterprise. And Austrian economists would be pleased with his emphasis on entrepreneurship, industry, and thrift. Eugen von Barbach and Max Weber recognized his genius, and so did American capitalists Andrew Carnegie and Thomas Mellon, who were deeply influenced by his autobiography. In fact, just by show of hands, how many have read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin? That's generally the case whenever I speak at groups on this. 5 to 10%. If you lived in the 20s, if you went to school in the 20s, every hand would go up. Every hand. The level of education is just another example of the decline in education, in my opinion, that people don't read the most famous autobiography that's ever been written after St. Augustine's Confessions. There's over a dozen various editions of the autobiography. You can get them in any Barnes & Noble bookstore. I brought copies of the original autobiography with me today. I have about a dozen copies, as well as the completed autobiography, which I did a couple years ago. So, he was an incurable optimist like most Americans. Franklin was always bullish on America. And at the end of the War of Independence, he predicted with accuracy, America is, with God's blessing, will become a great and happy country. Franklin was sympathetic with laissez-faire economics of the day. He was a free trader who wrote famously, "No nation was ever ruined by trade." And the other thing that was interesting about Franklin is he was a defender of commercial society. And for generations, for millennium, there was this negative view about merchants, about bankers, about speculators and so forth, that even carried on to the day where people like Thomas Jefferson and others looked very dimly down on bankers and the commercial society that enveloped. Franklin was one of the most important advancers or defenders of commercial society. He defended merchants. He defended speculators. He defended the banking community and so forth as an extremely important part of society, of commercial society. And he was a big fan of big cities. You see, Franklin did not agree with Jefferson, who advocated the agrarian society, that the farmer was the ideal, which came out of Aristotle and the Greeks and the Romans. Franklin was very much a modern person. Of all the founders, he is the most modern of them all in terms of his defending the rights of individuals, of races, of minorities, very much in defense of women's rights, of blacks being equal to whites. This was a minority view at that time. It was one that Franklin shared. He describes, he writes about it in a completed autobiography where he visited the Negro School of Philadelphia, which he helped found. And he went there and visited one day, and he said, "I was very much surprised to learn that the black students were just as bright as the white students." So, very controversial person at that time, and the first president of the Society to abolish slavery in Philadelphia. However, Frank, hold your applause because there's some parts you may not agree with. He was no social libertarian, despite the fact that he was famous for reading books in his room in the nude. He frequented the salacious Hellfire Club in London, where women of the evening dressed up as nuns. He flirted with the French ladies in Paris. I have a wonderful chapter in the book called The Ambassador's Life in France, which I think you'll really enjoy, about his tete-a-tetes with Madame Brionne and other wonderful ladies of this, at the time, who were brilliant, intelligent women who Franklin, they got along really well. Adams, John and Abigail Adams thought very differently, but Franklin loved the French ladies. But anyway, here's an interesting thing. Franklin wrote stern letters to his daughter Sally, chastising her for wanting to wear the latest fashions while a war was going on, and refused to buy his grandson Benny a gold watch while in France. He dressed plainly and constantly preached economy. He promoted at all times frugality and industry in both public and private life. And when he returned, after being in London for a number of years, returned to Philadelphia and attacked the growth of taverns in Philadelphia in 1762. He hated mobs of all kinds, and though a defender of free speech, railed against scurrilous newspaper reports. And he was no friend of John Wilkes, who is a famous character in British society, the defender of free speech, who was imprisoned for libeling the King of England. But Franklin criticized the drunken, mad mobs that supported Wilkes and liberty. So he was a social conservative in many ways, later on in his older life, as many of us are as we get older. So I mentioned that he was a firm believer in democracy. He didn't really like the centralized executive. In fact, he proposed initially that instead of one president, there should be 12 executives. 12 executives running the government. So you can see he was not into central authority in that respect. He was opposed to public offices of profit. And here's a great quote from the historian Bernard Fay. He concludes, Congress was directly opposed to Franklin's philosophical tendency, which might be summed up in this formula. See if you recognize this formula. The least government possible is the greatest possible good. Boy, now that's a libertarian statement. If you're not applauding for that one, I don't even know why you're here. All right. So the other thing really good about Franklin, he was a strong believer in voluntary associations. Franklin was ahead of his time in financing good causes with his business profits. He was civil-minded earlier in his career, helping to finance the first fire company, the nation's oldest property insurance company, Philadelphia's first hospital, library, militia, all mostly with private funds. Now, I will tell you, he's famous for a lot of inventions, as you know. He's famous for the Franklin stove, for the lightning rod, for the bifocals. There's lots of things he's famous for, but did you know he invented the fundraising technique of matching funds? So we have him to blame for that. So those guys would get up and say, I'll match whatever you give us $100, I'll give you $100, and that sort of thing. He did that with the first Philadelphia hospital. He went to the government initially and he said, look, would you be willing to, we really need a hospital to help particularly the indigent and the poor. They just have nowhere to go. And the Pennsylvania Assembly said, no, that's not a proper use of government. I mean, we're not going to do that at all. And he said, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. If I can raise an equal amount of 2,000 pounds from the private sector, will you match it? And they said, yeah, go right ahead. There's no way you're going to raise 2,000 pounds. Well, that was a big mistake because Franklin was the fundraiser extraordinaire. There's never been anyone as good as he is. And he raised the 2,000 pounds, and so the government went and matched it. So that was the creation of the first private hospital. But Franklin was a tireless supporter of volunteer organizations in philanthropic projects. So the NGOs, non-government agencies, it was his style. Rather than depending on the government and the great lords as they did in Europe and France and so forth, Americans offered a better way. And de Tocqueville talks about this. Volunteer collective action and self-help individualism was very much the vogue for Franklin. He didn't care much for the poor laws and other forms of public charity, but was a strong supporter of private charities and good causes. So you have some wonderful stories in the autobiography, in the completed autobiography, where he wasn't particularly much of a churchgoer, but when he did attend church, and Reverend Whitfield is famous for having an ability to convince people to give money to good causes. And Whitefield had, he wanted to start an orphanage in Georgia. And Franklin was very much opposed to this. He said, no, if we're going to have an orphanage, let's have it in Philadelphia. Why should we have it in Georgia? But Whitefield said, no, we've got to have it in Georgia. And so Franklin came and attended a church service where Reverend Whitefield was trying to raise money for his Georgia program. And so Franklin says, as I entered and sat down at the pew, I was determined not to give him a single penny. But he said after 10 minutes of his oratory, I was finally convinced, oh, okay, I'll reach in, I'll give him some of my coppers. And then another 10 minutes in his oratory, and he says, wow, this guy is so convincing, I guess I better give him my silver. And by the time he was through with the oration, Franklin had reached into his pocket, even taken out his gold coins. He gave him everything. So really an incredible ability to be suckered in. All right, so anyway, the City Watch Fire Company, Pennsylvania Academy, which became the University of Pennsylvania, the Negro School of Philadelphia. He gave money to all of the churches, Jewish places, all of the religious organizations, but always did it anonymously so he didn't offend anybody. He wrote of these private initiatives, I have always thought that one man of tolerable abilities might work great changes and accomplish great affairs of mankind. And in another part of the book, in the completed autobiography, and when I give it to people, I always refer to him to page 283, and it's a great little quote. He says, it's incredible the quantity of good that a single person can do if he makes a business out of it. All right. So, early in his career, he encouraged his son, William, to become a public servant, and he was appointed the royal governor of New Jersey. He ended up destroying his friendship, because what happened during the war was his son William turned against him and decided to remain a loyalist during the war. So I'm just going to read you one little part here from the completed autobiography. The completed biography, by the way, is all in Franklin's own words, so it's not mine. My wife and I edited it. We went through 50 volumes of the papers of Benjamin Franklin, which are being compiled at Yale University. And we culled through there and came up with the rest of the story. Franklin's original autobiography here ends in 1757, when he was age 53. And so there's nothing in the original autobiography about the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, his ambassador to France, the creation of a new constitution, the new nation. None of that's in here. And so it's very disappointing when you read the autobiography. And it's a great book about a man who goes from rags to riches and how he becomes a super success and then makes his scientific contributions and his civic contributions and so forth. Definitely worth reading. But there's nothing about the political Franklin like there is in the completed autobiography that my wife were able to do and put this through, and it's just been turned out to be a wonderful experience of completing his autobiography. So anyway, let me just read to you a little quote here that I think will give you a sense of how Franklin felt about getting his son involved by making him the royal governor of New Jersey. Nothing has ever hurt me so much and affected me with such keen sensations as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son, William. And not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me in a cause where my good fame, fortune, and life were all at stake. William conceived, he said, that his duty was to his king, and regard for his country required this. I ought not to blame him for differing in sentiments with me in public affairs. We are men all subject to errors. Our opinions are not in our power. They are formed and governed much by circumstances that are inexplicable. His situation was such that few could censure his remaining neutrality, though there are natural family duties which precede political ones and cannot be extinguished by them. This is a disagreeable subject. I drop it. So I think you can sense a little bit of the power that's there in Franklin. So what I'd like to do is do a little conclusion here, and then we can open up to questions, arguments, and so forth regarding Dr. Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, in conclusion, had his share of foibles. But in many ways, he was ahead of his time. How do we balance his magnificent achievements achievements with its flaws. Well, before you make up your mind, I recommend that you study the man himself. One of the reasons my wife and I completed and edited the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin was so that you could read Franklin's own words. You know, there's been lots of biographies written about Franklin. There's probably, you can go in any bookstore and you'll see 3 or 4 biographies written about Franklin. And they all have their prejudices. And I read through these things and they say, well, yeah, he's very critical of his attitude, the way he treated his wife, Deborah. He basically abandoned Deborah as he went over to London as the London agent, and then she died while he was in London. He didn't come back to see her for many years. He basically abandoned her. And then when you read Franklin's own writings, where on numerous occasions he begged his wife to come over from Pennsylvania to London, she simply had one of these phobias, aversions to being on the high seas. Kind of like some people don't like to get in airplanes for whatever reason. So they drifted apart. It wasn't like it was some kind of malicious abandonment. You get that sense in reading the completed autobiography. I'll give you one other example of Franklin's prowess. And this is when he was over as ambassador to France. And he'd been there for 4 or 5 years, and he had raised all this money to fight the war, basically to finance arms, to get loans from the French. And he was able to raise millions of livres, while the other commissioners were unfriendly to the French. Franklin was the only one who got along with the French, and they just adored the man. So Congress was absolutely determined to get more money and get as much money they could from France in terms of loans and gifts and that sort of thing. And Franklin was their man. They didn't have anyone else. So they write this letter to Franklin and say, well, you know, you've raised a lot of money, but we need 25,000 livres in addition to all the money you've raised. And Franklin writes back and he says, are you kidding me? I have reached the limit of my ability to raise money. The French just don't have that ability. You can't ask me. Please don't ask me to raise more money. And they came back and they said, no, we're desperate. We're out of money. We need help from the French, or our cause is lost. So Franklin reluctantly wrote in his finest diplomatic pen a letter to the King of France and to Vergennes, the French foreign minister Vergennes, and begged him for this money. And basically said, listen, if you don't give us this money, you're going to lose the war, we're going to lose the war, and the British will now dominate France and America and the rest of the Western world for the next 200 years. Is that what you want? We beg of you, we need you to borrow money. So he sends out this wonderful letter in his best diplomatic pen. Here's absolutely nothing. A week goes by, no response. 2 weeks goes by, no response. So Franklin writes another letter. Did you get my letter? Please, can you give me a response? And finally Vergennes says, come to Versailles and we will discuss it. So he quickly gets in his carriage. He goes to Versailles, which is an hour outside of Paris. And he's ushered in to Vergennes' office, and Vergennes is there to greet him. No smile, has a very depressed look on his face, shaking his head, and he says, Dr. Franklin, we know that you're broke. We know that all the money we loaned you, you're never going to be able to repay. And not only that, Dr. Franklin, but we're broke. We don't have any money in the treasury at all. So I'm sorry, Dr. Franklin. We cannot loan you 25,000 livres. We can't loan you anything. I'm sorry. And then he paused. And then he said, but because of your love of the French people, and because of the love the King of France has for you, he is going to give you out of his own pocket 6 million livres. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we call fundraising. So Jeff has his work cut out for him tonight, I'm sure. Or maybe Ben Franklin can help, who knows. Anyway, I thank you very much. I do want to mention one thing. I brought some copies of the original autobiography. It's volume 1, and it's a very special edition that Gregory published, and then the completed autobiography. And for those of you who do purchase it, I have a rare Franklin stamp that I put in each edition with the inscription, and one of them includes the only stamp that was made on the 100th anniversary of the post office, 1947. It's the only stamp of George Washington, the father of our country, and Benjamin Franklin, the grandfather of our country, together on one stamp. So if you buy the book, you'll get a copy of the rare stamp as well. So I'll be here afterwards. But I'd like to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions or wishes to debate, any discussion about Benjamin Franklin. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned that Franklin was unfortunate with his son and his grandson. What happened with the grandson?
Well, he had several grandsons through William. William had an illegitimate son. William himself was illegitimate, and William had an illegitimate son as well. And so Benny was the problem. He loved his grandsons and so forth. The biggest problem was their getting into trouble with women and you know, following in footsteps of the grandkids and so forth. And the divisiveness between the son and the grandson, who was going to stay with whom, and it created a lot of problems with the family.
So then the part of the does the Franklin on the William Franklin side, do they still their descendants still live in England?
No, there are some relatives that do live in Europe, France as well. Temple sired a illegitimate child, so you had like 3 generations illegitimacy there. And that was one reason that fostered the tradition that Franklin had lots of illegitimate children. In fact, he only had 1, and the rest of them were legitimate. Yeah, most of the ancestors, I've attended a number of the reunions, the family reunions. We hold it every 6 years in Philadelphia, and they're all from America. I've yet to meet a European descendant of Franklin, but there are supposedly some. Yeah. Yes?
Did you want to tell the Isle Royale story, or you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure what you mean.
I've read that when the U.S. and England were dickering over the exact boundaries of the United States, there was a big map of Lake Superior, and when the British were out of the room, Franklin altered the map and he added a bunch of islands to Lake Superior. And then the British came back in, and Franklin said, you know, if you would just give us Isle Royale, which is much closer to Canada than the U.S., you could have all these other islands. And they agreed, and there were...
Yeah, I'd never heard that story.
That's why...
Yeah. I will tell you that Franklin really wanted all of Canada as part of the deal. And there's a lot to be argued for that as far as culturally being very similar. And it's ridiculous to have a border at all between Canada and the United States. But that was one of his wishes that was not fulfilled. But no, I hadn't heard that story, so that's a new one on me. Yeah.
Is your book in addition to the first one? You got to buy 2, or is your book?
No, you can buy the original or the completed autobiography. It's volume 1, volume 2, and together it's the complete history from his birth all the way to very close to his death in the book. And as you can see, The original autobiography is about 120 pages, and a completed autobiography, and this is very true of his life. If you look at the papers of Benjamin Franklin, the 50 volumes, the first 4 volumes cover this period. The rest of the volumes cover this period. So you can see our editing had to be pretty deft to reduce the huge amount of paper. But it's very interesting. I've read just a few snippets from Franklin's own views, but you do get a really different picture, in my opinion, by reading this in Franklin's. Again, this is all Franklin's own words, and the historians that have read it have told me that it sounded like Franklin wrote it himself. So I think we did a pretty good job of weaving together his autobiographical writings. And just to give you an example, 1776. If you look at the papers of Franklin and look at the section 1776, tragically, there's virtually nothing in there. And so I'm saying, man, how can we complete Franklin's autobiography? We have nothing on the most important year in American history, 1776, because Franklin was so busy he didn't have a lot of time. Here's what happened. I discovered a long letter that, of all people, Arthur Lee wrote to his brother Richard Henry Lee 2 years after the Revolution. And he finally said, Dr. Franklin and I finally had a free moment, an evening together. We had nothing to do, and we sat down, and Dr. Franklin waxed eloquently about what had happened in 1776. And he writes it down. Dr. Franklin said, Dr. Franklin said, Dr. Franklin said, page after page. Guess what's in here? All I did was change Dr. Franklin said to I said, or what have you. And it's just a beautiful description of what happened in 1776. And so that'll be something that I think a lot of you will find of great value. But you can buy either volume if you want. Most people buy the volume because it's a real nice combination. Yes? Is there an e-edition? I don't know. Go on Amazon and see if an e-edition is available. That may be the case. That may be the case. Yeah.
Do you have any idea or any theory about what happened to his papers from 1776?
Well, his papers, a lot of his papers were lost because they were not burned, but destroyed by the British when the British took Philadelphia after he was in France. So he was very embittered about that sort of thing because he was meticulous in keeping records. So that's another reason why there are definitely some things that are lost, but we were able to fill in from beginning to end his views on religion, his views on women. I think you'll find a chapter in particular, An Ambassador's Life to France, really very interesting. Any other questions? Well, very good. Thank you all very much. I'll be right down here if you're interested. Thank you.
I want the